I've gotten into combat sports the last few months. It's cool to watch people beat the shit out of each other for whatever reason.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
And I'm Eliot.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us today. Today we are going to kind of have a follow-up to our discussion on tactics that players can use for in the game. This follow-up, we're going to be focusing on what the GM can do, and in bringing tactics to the creatures and NPCs that the player characters are going to be fighting. As I was looking back on just the resources that have been available over the years for tactics for the game master, I particularly looked back at the 4th edition and 3.5 editions of D&D. I completely forgot these two little details. In the 3.5 monster manual for the iconic monsters, there were suggestions of what they would take in the first 5 rounds of combat. So for like the big badass adult red dragon or something like that, you would have a suggestion of the first 5 rounds of combat, what it would do round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it would do this for other creatures too, like the Baylor had an entry like that, and that has really, I didn't remember that was where it came from, but that has been something that I've been doing for probably since I saw the 3.5 monster manual and saw that information in there. I've been doing that for the big climactic fights that I want to actually make sure that they have an actual impact in the game, like that the players actually feel something for, and that's kind of what the impetus for this particular topic is, and also the where I really as the GM started looking at what the monsters can do besides just your standard roll initiative, and I figure out round by round what is going to happen in the combat. What do you guys typically do for a combat that you're wanting to specifically be an important combat, and that you want to actually have some staying power in the minds of the players? Do you do anything special to prep for the combats?
Well, I think as you guys know, I don't do shit. This is easily, as a DM anyway, the place I need to grow. And it's so funny you should say that, Clayton. That's I never have ever thought to do that. It seems so obvious, but sometimes the obvious isn't so obvious to me. That's a great idea. Yeah, man, I just rely on the stats and just kind of, I don't really think a whole lot about it. I usually just place them on the board and let the chips fall where they may, but I think I'm a perfect example of a DM that's doing it wrong, because so many times I have a hard time either keeping my monsters with, especially in the big boss 1-on-5 combats. I just as a DM, I typically have a bad time piloting the solo big bads. What do you do, Jordan?
Well, for the last couple of years, I haven't had to worry about this in the same way, because I've mostly ran post-apocalyptic stuff, working on Apocalyptia. So for that, all I'm really worried about is what's sound tactics for human adversaries, for the most part, raiders and whatever else. And depending on what kind of scenario, you got like zombies, which are just completely without tactics. They're just an attack algorithm that you have to work out. So I haven't had to really wrap my head around what intelligent non-human tactics for opponents should be in a while, but I'm getting ready to start a first edition and like old school D&D game, and I've been looking through a lot of these adventures, and that is not something that it gives you very much on. So it's something I've been kicking around a lot lately, because some of these adversaries, like dragons are hundreds of years old, and they got to be that way because they were smart, and they've been fighting for hundreds of years and know what works and what doesn't. And then you've got like real alien things that like just won't even be considering stuff in the same way that humans would approach a fight for a bunch of different reasons. So I don't know, this is a perfect time for me to jump into a podcast like this, because this is all like fresh considerations in my mind.
Why are dragons smart? I've been getting back into Tolkien and working on a game world that I've been doing for a while. I've been going back and relooking at my notes, and that just occurred to me. It's like, is there something from mythology that I'm missing here? Why are D&D dragons intelligent?
I think it's because of the like biblical origin of it. Like they're a stand-in for the devil. They're demonic in nature. They're not just like regular animals. They're some kind of like primeval spirit, manifest evil incarnate, and at least that's the Western dragon. And then the Eastern dragon's a similar thing, but aligned directly the opposite. So
there was a dragon in Beowulf, right? Was it intelligent? I thought it was just like a beast.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the one in Beowulf was just a beast.
Anywho, sorry for the distraction, squirrel. Continue on.
No, that's perfectly on point. I mean, because there are dragons in D&D that are more intelligent than humans by far. Like a lot of them are genius level intelligence creatures and cast at extremely high level as wizards. They're not just dinosaurs with wings.
I mean, is it because in Tolkien's mythology, Smaug was intelligent? You think that's probably I'd say that's probably where it comes from, the Tolkien version of dragons. But Smaug was intelligent, but all of his, in the Silmarillion stuff, they weren't very, I don't remember, like, Glaurung. I guess they were all intelligent, weren't they? That's probably it. I have a hard time running intelligent creatures, obviously. Just like it's difficult to play a smart character that's above your own intelligence. I have a hard time designing intelligent, because I'm just not a tactically minded person.
Well, the biggest key to it is just actually taking the time to think about it a little bit. You'd be surprised how much a combat would be improved if you just think about the most basic things about what a creature is and what it can do. Like, the first thing that I look at whenever I'm looking at a stat block for a creature, regardless of what game it is I look to see, does it have a gimmick? Does it have something that it is either iconically known for, or does it have something on there that is a power that not everything else has? And I basically start looking at the gimmick and seeing, okay, this is a part of the stat block for a reason. This gimmick is a core part of this thing. How would it use it in a combat? And how can I get it to use that ability as quickly as possible in combat? Because if a monster has a gimmick and it dies before its gimmick happens, it's a complete waste, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Looking at the gimmicks, I would say 4th edition D&D was the best as far as giving each individual monster its own very specific niche thing that it could do. 5th edition does it as well. Pretty much everything has a line item that it can do, but I saw the origin of this in 4E. I remember in 3rd edition all of 3rd edition, there were some monsters that were literally just their core stats, a few skills, and their attack description, and like their attack bonus and their damage, and nothing else about that creature. Those are the ones I hate to run in combat because it's just boring. It's just bland. And I have a problem with game systems that are, let's say, not as nitty gritty when it comes to the stats of a monster. Like a lot of the game systems that are more free form, they're much more basic, as far as like everything having pretty much the same abilities, and it's just each one uses their abilities in a slightly different way. I have a lot of a problem coming up with how those things fight. Although I have said many, many times on this podcast that I absolutely love Savage Worlds as a game system, I think that's probably the place that the Savage Worlds system lacks the most in, is that a lot of the monsters in there are just the same stats at different levels, rather than giving each and everything something unique that it can do.
Let's talk. I mean, maybe this is taken in a different direction, but one thing I put more thought into, even obviously, than the monsters, what they did is the play area, the actual physical space you're trying to represent that they're playing. And I found that for a DM, I had a DM once who really put a lot of thought and energy into the battle mat, and he would, he used miniatures and would make his own miniatures, would make these beautiful set pieces, often just custom for one battle, and over the course of a game, he eventually he had so much terrain that when we would go to a battle, it would fill the table, and it was really epic and cool. Obviously, like you were saying, Clayton, every bad guy, usually, especially if they're worth if it's a higher level, higher CR, say in D&D, they're going to have some gimmick that brings their own flavor. But I found this in D&D, combat can get repetitive, and so do you guys? I know, Jordan, you're about to queue up a game. I don't believe you're going to play on a mat. How much do you think the terrain itself? How much consideration do you give it? Do you think how much of an impact does it make? I think it's a big deal, personally, in my experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, in any kind of tactical situation, your terrain is, one of your top concerns, and will probably make or break the battle depending on how you use it. As far as like, it's hard to do really compelling terrain stuff online and with D&D stuff, because it's all that like top-down perspective, so you really only have a two-dimensional thing to work with. In movies and stuff, there's all these cool situations where somebody's like, two guys are having a sword fight up on the battlements, and somebody's swinging off a rope onto some platform, and something collapses, and blah blah blah, and it's this whole like 3D interesting, like flowing dynamic world. I've never seen that get translated to a 2D grid map. As much as I'd love to see something like that, lava pits or whatever the fuck, it always just seems like really static once it's laid out there. I don't know. Is that what you're talking about? Like a living, breathing world to have a fight in?
Well, yeah, I mean, usually, like when I was running, I would think of things like elevation. I think that, I mean, sometimes it could be a bit much, but I always found that, like, I think we had the most fun in game when there was like a variety of complications. I always, having the area. So let's just talk about a dungeon. So say you're in a dungeon. And, maybe the fast and easiest way to a location is a room filled with, I don't know, I think it's in Phandelver. It has a noxious room, so I remember that you guys got into a fight and you had to retreat through that room, and it added a level of intensity that is more than more than just how many attacks am I going to make or whatever. So like having some obstacles in between players and their spaces. So if you need to get space between yourself and the bad guy, there's maybe a consequence, or maybe you can lure the bad guys into the consequence. Those types of using those area of effects stuff to your advantage can add flavor. Then, like I said, elevation. We had a particular map where there were like lots of stairs, and it was an outdoor space, but it was like a city scene, so there was staircases, and players kind of could either stick together or they could run. They could be in different locations, and it kind of isolated. You can isolate players in that way. I think that I always feel like that's an important element because D&D can get so stale, or just any game can get so stale when it just devolves into a swarm the big bad, hack. And if you're the DM on the opposite side, I feel like it can be. I always found myself in a lot of situations where I was like, okay, this is not a very fun encounter. I want to end this as soon as possible, right? And I think that's what you're trying to avoid. You've done a bad job whenever you're like, oh man, this is dragging. This kind of is boring. How can I end this ASAP?
What was that tower in Ravenloft with the big heart at the top of it and the spiral staircase that we were fighting inside of?
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it.
Okay, so we are going to have spoilers, some mild spoilers for Curse of Strahd.
Yeah, true that.
That was one of the more dynamic fights that I've been a part of in years, and that was a weird one thinking back on it, because there were at least two different kinds of adversaries that we were dealing with. There was the animated halberds that were just floating at us. I guess there's three. There was the wizard, and I think he had some spiders or something under his control down below. And then also some vampires showed up, like, from a side door or something. So that's, like, right there in that one fight, three radically different kinds of adversaries with completely different sets of powers and tactics that they would use and mental acuity to even execute all that.
Yeah. To kind of piggyback on that, if you're a new DM and if maybe you're a DM that kind of wants to spice up, get some better ideas, I guess, about your combats, it's never a bad idea to jump into, pre-made games, or to just play a pre-made, pre-gen game, modules and things. Anymore, I feel like I'm a big fan of them. I used to be a make it from scratch kind of guy, but just talking about Curse of Strahd, that's one of its strengths. But most settings have that too. Most pre-made modules, that's one of their strengths, is that they usually will have already planned all that stuff out for you. But in that particular case, there was another thing you were fighting against, and that was the tower itself. Having the terrain be a factor is always a good flavor, because the way that particular tower works, spoilers again, is that there's a very narrow staircase that goes several hundred feet up, and at different points it would shake, and everybody would run the risk of falling, and so multiple times people would fall, and it makes for a very dynamic game that once again, I think that if you can avoid the just devolving down into a hit to, just a roll hit. Oh shit, what am I thinking? A roll to hit over and over. I think that's a cue that maybe you should think a little deeper about your tactics, and terrain, I think, is always what I go to. What about you, Clayton?
Well, again, I like to think about the fights before they actually happen, and if I'm going to be introducing some sort of dynamic terrain element into it, or whether, and regardless, whenever the player characters are in a fight, I would estimate that like 75 to 90% of the time, it's the player characters who are initiating the fight. They are the ones who are going into the dungeon and attacking the monsters, or they are the ones who are setting up an ambush for monsters who are coming and attacking the town. Most of the time, I'm sorry, I mixed my my percentages there. Most of the time, the player characters are going into the monster's terrain in order to fight. They are going out to fight them, and it's much less likely that the player characters are going to be pulling the monsters into an ambush situation or into a situation where the player characters have control over the terrain and basically the dynamics of the fight. So I think it's really important that whenever you're creating this fight, if you've got a few minutes to think about it, think about what the home terrain advantage of the monsters is going to be. Because if you're fighting monsters in their lair or just in their home turf, they're going to know where things are. They're going to know how to use that terrain to their advantage. Even things of animal intelligence, like wolves, use their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage whenever they are hunting.
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed in some of these old modules that I'm starting to get into is that the caricature of old D&D as being just a bunch of like random rooms, random dungeon rooms full of random monsters, just monster condo nonsense with no dungeon ecology. That didn't last very long. That was maybe the first couple of magazine article dungeons and like convention dungeons that were mostly like, a competitive thing. When TSR started publishing modules with storylines involved, the dungeons were intricate, and if a monster has a lair, a bunch of monsters, living in a cave or whatever, they'll have symbiotic relationships with other, usually less intelligent monsters that are around them that will do things like, taking care of any trash that builds up. That's the whole purpose of the gelatinous cube, the oozes, all those weird slime monster things. They clean up dungeons. The the dark mantle and all those weird like kind of stalactite sort of like stealth ambush predator monsters. Those are there to just keep random animals and stuff from wandering in. And if it's orcs or trolls or whatever, they don't go fuck with them because they're serving a purpose. They're like spiders spinning webs and such. So yeah, there's like a lot of things going on that all work together and make sense if you look at it.
Clayton, I didn't get I'm curious. I didn't get a straight answer from you on that point. Do you like theater of the mind and versus a top-down or a three-dimensional MAD? And do you have a preference? What do you normally do, and how do you weave those together? And curious to know how do you guys feel like it affects tactics to be theater of the mind or versus using miniatures or some digital equivalent?
I do whatever the game system is built for. Like in D&D, I use a grid. In World of Darkness, I do not use a grid. So it really just depends on what I'm playing at the time as to whether or not I use those elements. I find that Theater of the Mind is so much better for creating a dynamic environment in which the player characters can fight. Because like Jordan was saying earlier about like whenever you're watching a movie and you've got like two people up on the battlements fighting, and then you've got another guy who's down in the courtyard holding off like a dozen enemies who are surging through the gate and stuff like that. Like that has a lot of movement in it. I feel like Theater of the Mind is absolutely great for that. Whenever you bring out the battle mat and you start placing tokens down, it gets bogged down and it gets static because there's always rules for enemies get attacks whenever you withdraw from combat. So you are punished for trying to move around the battlefield and gain what would actually be a tactical advantage in real life. You're punished for that in most games because enemies just get a shitload of hits against you. Or in like 5th edition D&D, you can forego all those hits, but you are severely limiting your own ability to affect the battlefield because you are being forced to only move that round. You can't take any other actions because you are disengaging. And so you just move usually 30 feet away, and then on the monster's turns, they all move 30 feet closer to you and they get their attacks against you. So they're on a battle mat or in a virtual tabletop where you actually have a grid where you can keep track of that. I use it, but there's always a part of me that really wishes that we could have those types of really dynamic fights where people are getting thrown across the room whenever they get hit by a giant, and it's not something where you've got to account for how on the grid that would be described, and or whether or not a giant actually has that ability to move something whenever it hits it.
Yeah, I'm going back and forth on what I want to do for this D&D game. A lot of these maps are pretty good, but the scale that people are going to be fighting on, I'm not sure that it's going to be necessary. And what I'm thinking about is, have you guys ever seen the isometric maps that started coming out in like the mid to late 80s in modules?
They're awesome.
I think the first one might have been Ravenloft in like 83 or something like that. It was Tracy and Laura Hickman, by the way. I think that's the best compromise because it shows you the 3D world, shows you where you can jump to and whatever, but it's still laid out in a grid so that you have a good idea of what your spacing is relative to each other. There is no virtual tabletop that's built to handle isometric maps like that. So the best that I could say is people just putting, a little squiggle representing their character on whatever square that they're on at a given time, and just updating it every turn. I really don't want to do the standard Roll20, top down tokens, blah blah blah. I'd rather narrate it.
I toyed around once upon a time of actually using an isometric map for a battle map and drawing out an isometric terrain, and actually being that's, since in the digital medium it's so much like easier to do. You couldn't do it in reality, obviously, but I guess you could. I've seen some terrain companies that make stackables that are kind of cool, but towards the end of the last game I ran, at first I was super committed to being on a mat all the time because there were so many cool maps that came with the setting. But as I went on, I started moving back towards a theater of the mind because, like you guys have said, I think it impacts. It's harder on the players to not have one and think tactically. But I don't know how many times when you do theater of the mind you hear people are walking out who's where or how. It's mm-hmm. It does become, it has its own limitations that I think we often shortchange in that directly impact tactics, especially in a game like D&D that's built for it. If you don't use a grid in a game that's kind of assumes you will, some of the powers, like for instance, oftentimes like ranged attacks are difficult theater of the mind because you typically have it feels very arbitrary as a DM to say whether or not someone's too far away. It's difficult to hold that all in your mind at once, too. It's like, well, which one of my players are maybe out of the range of their weapon, which players are not. You just kind of end up giving carte blanche to anybody can hit anybody, which it maybe is fine for most. I don't know. I definitely prefer playing on the grid. I think we're going on and on about this, but um, maybe a good question about tactics that comes to my mind that maybe we can pivot on is, you know, I think everybody's played in the one big bad, right? Where you're the DM, you've got one big creature. But then, how do you integrate henchmen? Do you guys put a lot of thought into maybe not a super big bad? Maybe it's the main bad of the session, but it's a fairly low level guy. How do you do group encounters where you as the DM you're running multiple NPCs in one situation, and how do you go about deciding how they jive together?
Well, I look at why is the fight happening and when is the fight over. Are the enemies are they intelligent enemies? Are they there to kill the player characters? Are they there to incapacitate them? Are they there for some other objective? I take those questions into account, and then I start building out how the fight would go from there. That's when I do my 5 rounds of combat, like my prescribed 5 rounds of combat, where I figure out what everybody is going to be doing at the beginning of combat. I don't think I have ever run a combat where we got to the end of the 5 rounds and all of the enemies have done the 5 things I prescribed, because combat is dynamic and no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But I like to have that in mind whenever I'm going in, because it gives me a framework to deal with the situation as it develops. If I know what their objectives are, or how they're going to be going about accomplishing their objectives. If I've got a big bad and they've got some henchmen, those henchmen, what are their goal? Is their goal to tie up the player characters so that the big bad can one-on-one a particular enemy? Is their objective to rush the spellcaster so that they are constantly in melee whenever they're trying to cast spells? Is their objective to take out the healer? I give every group that is in the combat some sort of a goal like that, and I just run the combat from there, because if I have a general idea of what each group is trying to accomplish and what each group is trying to do, whenever it comes up on their turn, I think, what's the one thing that they're doing this round? Okay, how can they accomplish that? Boom, I've got their actions for the round. That's how I try to keep my combats dynamic and account for all of the crazy shenanigans that the player characters will do in the meantime.
That's good stuff. That makes me want to run a game again, because I love that you found that in D&D 3rd edition. I had forgotten about that, but just the idea of script, like setting a 5 round, I think that's very doable. It's probably not that hard, not time consuming, but man, I bet it adds so much to the organization and really just the realistic element of combats, because I mean, anybody that's facing off with deadly combatants, it's not like they're scrubs. Even if they are scrubs, people fight with intention, right? That does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and the source that I point to that I got the idea for creating the tactics that each group is going to be doing for that particular combat, I pull that from 4th edition, because in 4th edition, each stat block in the monster manual and every subsequent monster stat block had a 1 or 2 sentence of the tactics that they would use, and in particularly the Dungeon magazine that was released for 4th edition, every single adventure, every single fight had a tactics section that gave 1 or 2 sentences about what each group in the fight was trying to accomplish in the fight. And as I was going back and looking at this, and I think back of all of the things that I've said about 4th edition over the years, I realize that 4th edition D&D did a lot of the really small things really right, as far as how to create dynamic fights. It's just a shame that they didn't carry hardly any of these over into 5th edition.
I think motives is a big thing to consider. You guys both brought that up. What is the enemy fighting for, and what is their win condition? It's probably not always going to be just a TPK, but if it's an animal, animals usually avoid fights. Animals will fight to protect territory or children or for food if they're predators. If an animal and most people take a substantial amount of damage, they're going to run away. And that's something that was in D&D originally. It was morale checks, due to its legacy as, coming from war games. When a unit would take like a third of their number in casualties, they'd roll for morale to see if they break and, retreat or fully routed or whatever. And that carries over to monsters. I don't know of any modern edition of Dungeons and Dragons that took anything like that into account. It's pretty much always a fight to the death, regardless of what's going on. And I'll be interested to see how that mechanic changes the way that people fight.
I love those behavioral mechanics in games that definitely D&D lacks. Just anything like that. Willpower, some sort of resolve check, some sort of like sanity check in some games. I know there's like in the DM's guide they give a few additional optional rule sets, but yeah, I mean, because if you leave it to the players and they have no reason they have no reason to check themselves, it's always, players never run away. Players don't care how injured they are. They can always roll up a new character. So putting it in the system is, I think, something that is missed.
Yeah, that's the thing I'm most interested in seeing in Jordan's game, is how the player characters will react to the broken morale of our henchmen.
It goes both ways, If you ambush a bunch of orcs and get a bunch of good kills on the first round, that party of orcs that may actually outnumber you very well may just scatter off into the woods, and maybe they regroup later, maybe they don't. There's only a handful of monsters that kind of thing wouldn't apply to, and it'd be things that you'd expect, like golems and stuff like that wouldn't give a shit. There's a few intermediary things that it's not clear on how to run that I'm interested in playing with. Like, for example, trolls. The reason most things run away when they get hurt is that, like, wounds in nature are often fatal, but if you're a creature that naturally heals at an extreme rate, you're not going to have that same instinct to run away as soon as you start bleeding significantly, unless there's fire involved for a troll. Likewise, undead creatures, some of them are somewhat intelligent, wraiths and things like that, and they're not even used to getting hit. But if they, someone takes a swipe at them with a +1 sword or something that actually connects, I don't know, do wraiths get morale checks? I have to work that out.
So we've started talking a little bit about just kind of how we've kind of started easing into how particular things might fight. Whenever I'm trying to figure out how a particular thing is going to fight, I pull mostly from being a kid and just watching as many nature documentaries as I could find on TV. Like, whenever I was in my single digits and early teens, I watched a ton of Wild America with Marty Stauffer, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdoms, stuff like that. And I draw a lot of my particularly animal tactics from that, but also a lot of monster tactics as well, particularly monsters that aren't of human intelligence. And there's a lot of just really canny things that subhuman intelligence is capable of doing in a fight. Jordan, you alluded to kind of the main motivations for why animalistic creatures would fight. They fight to eat. They fight to protect themselves. They fight to protect their young. They fight to protect their territory. And I love watching nature documentaries. One thing that you learn, particularly with pack animals, is why there are flanking or gang up or pack tactics mechanics in pretty much every tactical role-playing game, because that shit works. That's why wolves are apex predators. That's why lions are apex predators. That's why dolphins are apex predators, is because they use the ability to take down their enemies. They use the strength of each individual to take down foes that are often many times bigger than them.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary on wolves just the other day, and it's no wonder that even in areas where wolves are extinct or maybe haven't ranged there in forever, I'm thinking like England. I guess in England, the wolves have been extinct for a couple hundred years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Yet there are
wolves were extinct in England before the birth of George Washington.
But there's a ton of memory in our culture, because I could imagine being like a Middle Ages or, just an ancient person walking down the road, and then you go off to like take a poop or something like that. And then the next thing you know, you start seeing 5, 10, 15, wolves kind of off in the woods. I mean, talk about shit your pants. You were done for, mate.
That does bring up one point, is that a lot of things of whatever intelligence will observe their prey for a while before they go in for an attack. They'll size things up, they'll figure out what the advantage is, and they're only going to attack when they feel that they do have an advantage. They might lurk around for ages looking for the straggler to pick off. But it's not like these things are just attack robots, animal level intelligence creatures. Like these things will have a plan in mind, and you know what I mean. It's not like a video game.
Yeah,
it shouldn't feel that way.
I think I've seen DMs over the years, and certainly when it comes to combat, I feel like as a DM, that's my weak spot. I'm kind of a novice when it comes to designing combats and encounters. But that said, I've definitely seen some people fall into some common mistakes, and I think one thing to avoid, there's eventually you're going to have the big bad fight, right, where it's 1v5 or 1v party. But for the most part, that is, I've found to be a bit of a lazy and not the most fun way to run an encounter for either side. And so just avoiding, it's usually the most fun encounters are definitely the ones where there's multiple opponents. They don't all reveal at once. So like you were saying, Jordan, layering in some tactics where maybe you have a couple of, there's some designated roles where people make first contact. And then, to reveal ranged, using range is key to making an encounter kind of fun. Providing cover for your players and for your bad guys is another spice that I think that makes an encounter fun. Making sure that those ranged attacks are going at the right people. Making sure the finger wigglers, that your magic users, your healers, they're taking special kinds of pressure, because without those types of things thought of and implemented, you're going to have, the players are designed for this shit. I mean, you're going to have your tanking, you're going to have your wizard controlling, and you're going to have your healer keeping those guys up, and your support guys doing their thing. So if you put a straightforward encounter, kind of like the old line combat of the Civil War days, as your typical way, you just kind of line everybody up and they charge. The players are going to run; they're going to just wreck. Period. And then if you have a one moderately powerful bad guy, numbers are key. You could take how do you guys? How many of you guys have had this experience where you'll have a big bad fight in one session, and it goes like nothing? Then the next session you fight just a swarm of low level guys or monsters or whatever, and it almost TPKs. The number of opponents is a huge consideration.
Yeah, that just goes back to action economy, where the ability to do more things allows you to accomplish more. Like having what's this phrase? More hands in the kitchen make for less work. So in a combat, the more people that you actually have being in the combat and taking attacks, whichever side has the most is, all things being equal, the side that has more actions is going to win. That's why fighting an individual enemy is often the player characters just gang up on it and just take it down. Even if it's a creature that is supposed to be a very tough fight for them, the player characters can just destroy it because they have the advantage of being able to do so many different things to it, whereas one opponent only has their actions on their turn that they can do. And more often than not, smart players will be employing things that will prevent that creature from using the full extent of its power on its turn. And that's something that goes both ways. So if you're playing a group of monsters, if you're constructing a combat where you've got monsters that are either outnumber the player characters or can strategically target particular characters for particular attacks. The example earlier of going for like healers first, or trying to mess up the spellcaster to prevent them from being able to cast spells. Having multiple opponents allows for that diversity, and it makes the combat fun for the player characters because they feel threatened whenever it's not just the fighter in the front going toe-to-toe with a single enemy and then the rest of them just unleashing hell upon whoever is being held at the front line. Being able to break that up really helps make, one, dynamic fights, and two, fun fights, because I don't know about you, but if I'm playing a ranged character, I don't feel threatened until something actually comes up and takes a whack at me. Because usually if I'm playing a ranged character, I do everything I can to avoid that from happening.
Yeah, and most opponents, like, the DM should keep in mind that the opponents that you're putting up against your party, those enemies want to survive the encounter. They want to survive most likely more than they want to win. And when they've got a couple of different powers or attack modes that are at their disposal, they're going to use the one that puts them at the least amount of risk. A goblin would probably throw a rock into a melee before he would charge in and start stabbing with his dagger or short sword or whatever. In the book that I've been leafing through, it's going to be my geek thing. It mentions that over time, over something's life, an enemy, a monster, whatever, this thing would learn in D&D terms that attacks that cause the player, the target character to make a saving throw against their attack, on balance, is more effective than one that requires the enemy to make an attack roll against the character. And even if the one that requires the attack roll does more damage. And the reason being is that the built-in assumption with the saving throw is that it hits unless the character can successfully avoid it. Whereas with the attack, by default, the character is fine unless the enemy can roll and prove that they did in fact connect and do some damage. And even if the saving throw is successful a lot of times, it still gets some damage through because it's saved for half. And those kind of like mathematical considerations that seem kind of metagamey have some in-world component that enemy knows about. They know the efficacy of their powers, right? So I don't know. That's just a point I wanted to bring up.
I think it's related to something I've been keeping in my mind through listening to you guys talk. Is I love me some conditions. I love me some conditions as a DM. That because it does get very monotonous to just throw melee attacks, and like you were kind of getting at, Jordan, is that creatures don't want to die if they don't have they will. I mean, they don't fight fair. They shouldn't. It could be an enemy spellcaster that throws in spells, but it could be things like poisons. A lot of like you were saying, Clayton. Most of the enemies out there, a lot of the interesting monsters have, they have abilities, and that ability might be stunning or paralyzing or exhausting, things of that nature. To give a bunch of low-level guys, poisoned arrows and even if it's a super low check, like that accumulates. If every, even if it's like a DC 10 on a roll on a D20 save, you'd think that would be not a big deal, but if someone has to make 3 or 4 of those over the course of a combat, they're probably going to fail one of those. And there's nothing more satisfying as a DM for me is to see the tank just like fall over from paralysis for like 2 rounds or something like that, and watch the rest of the party just freak out.
That's why Drow sucked in 2nd edition, because they all had poison arrows with it. Had a very mild poison, but it put the target, I want to say, to sleep.
Oh, sleep. I love that spell.
Holy crap. If you've got an enemy caster and they're not casting sleep on a first level party, like that's how you TPK a first level party of D&D characters. It's a fucking sleep spell.
Yeah, it's really not fair.
So we've kind of alluded a little bit to how you can take down particular player characters who have who are going to cause trouble for the player, for the monsters. One of the things that I often run into whenever I'm running a game is, Jordan, your character from our Eberron game, a character who has maximized their armor class or made it so that they're practically impossible to hit with a melee attack or with a particular type of attack. What are some strategies that you guys have for getting around that? And Jordan, you already gave one of them, which was like, instead of like hitting them with stuff that makes them save, rather than having to actually hit them in order to affect them, giving them save effects. Do you guys have any other examples of things that work for just doing something to an enemy who can't be hit?
I mean, you pretty much just nailed it. It doesn't, I mean, to me, nothing in particular comes to mind other than just, as you get into the monster manual of, say, if we're talking 5th edition D&D, but it's, is you're going to find the majority of the monsters have some sort of trick. And a lot of times it is just, some sort of minor wisdom check. One thing that I did in my last game, though, towards the end, as you guys got more powerful, is that I made a spreadsheet that had all of your saves listed just in one spot, so that whenever I would, think about creating encounters, I began to intentionally work in creatures or particular, bad guys or whatever. I would give them ways to hit you guys where you were, weak. Think about your party, and maybe everybody dumps stats charisma. Well, go find a spell or a particular type of creature that really, takes advantage of a charisma check. Those types of things is how I got to where I was thinking of. And it made things a lot more interesting.
That particular character was a paladin, and so even the saves weren't that big of a concern. That dude was just a walking fortress. But what was a challenge is keeping a big monster's attention on me. And we had a couple of pretty interesting fights there, Clayton, where there'd be a monster like that Kraken. I remember there's a few other ones where it would try to bite me or whatever a couple times, and I'd do my thing and just try to stay toe to toe with it and keep it tangled up while the weaker like glass cannon ranged guys whittled away at the thing. But when it would eventually figure out that it couldn't hit me and then go after one of the casters or something like that, there's a whole nother game that I have to start playing there where I'm like, trying to climb on a big monster or trying to lasso it or something to like, keep it focused on me where it's safest. So that was fun. I thought that was a completely legit tactic in the face of, my build.
One thing that's often, I was just thinking, it's just kind of, and I know I don't do this, but I think it's worth doing. But, especially in medieval kind of games where people are just decked out in metal, throw some water in there. I mean, if you have a player like, say, a 5th edition paladin that's all stacked, that's just stacked, they really don't like deep water. Throw them in the drink.
Unless they're a warforged and they don't need to breathe air, right, Jordan?
I fucking hate those creatures. I know in Eberron they're native to the setting, but I've always found the warforged to be just kind of like, part of me feels like D&D jumped the shark whenever they introduced a robot.
Dude, it's going back to the foundations. There are robots mentioned in the original OD&D monster books. Like, Dungeons and Dragons at its core is science fantasy, and it's gotten away from that over the 80s and 90s. But I'm telling you, there's a weird, like, old school high adventure, anything goes, like, we're just romping the multiverse kind of vibe to D&D, and robots are legit, like, first generation D&D monsters.
Yeah, I always thought the Dragonborn, the Tiefling, and the Warforged, when they became playable characters, part of me was just like, okay, cool story, bro. I don't know. Not into it.
What do you have against Tieflings? Tieflings have been a player character race since the Planescape campaign setting in 1992.
I don't know. I just think they're stupid. There's really no reasonable argument I have for it other than I just read this and I was like, this is stupid.
So we're starting to get a little bit long. Do we have any other burning things that we need to get off our chest on how to deal with things before we wrap up?
There's a couple things I want to bring up. And I think that a lot of the concerns that we're talking about and like strategies and stuff, this was thought about a long time ago. And there are monsters and spells in Dungeons and Dragons that are specifically about dealing with like posing a threat to characters that are way too difficult. So one thing that comes immediately to mind is the rust monster that will just disintegrate whatever equipment that it touches. And it's not out to kill anybody. It's out to eat the pile of rust that it turns your armor and sword and whatever else into. Another thing is dispel magic, like disenchantment stuff. But I get the feeling that the 5th edition culture of the game has really shied away from those sorts of things in the same way that it's that before they got away from like level drain and permanent ability damage to con and things like that. It seems almost taboo to fuck with characters at this point, like on that level. If you're doing something that's not like a temporary kind of setback, like hit points or a status condition that could be recovered, with some spells or whatever, but like straight up dispelling somebody's magic weapon just into a mundane thing, or having something literally just eat the armor off their body. I don't know. Do you guys get the feeling like this game like really encourages that or would even allow that at this point on like a cultural kind of level.
Yeah, I definitely feel what you're saying. I definitely notice it and notice that expectation that if you're going to like, it's just an unspoken rule that the DM doesn't do that anymore, where they permanently fuck up a character by taking something away that they have fought for or earned or like I, that is a core part of their character. I It's just something that's changed about the mentality of D&D, where back in the day they had things like Helm of Opposite Alignment, where you put it on and it's a cursed item where suddenly your lawful good paladin becomes a chaotic evil, and there's not really anything else that can be done about it. You just got to deal with it. I see those types of things that cause irreparable harm as no longer being in the spirit of the rules anymore.
Yeah, and judging by the success of 5th edition, when the inevitable 6th edition comes out, I would expect that to remain, if not go further somehow. I don't know how much further they can go in the player's direction, but yeah, I agree. I mean, it feels bad. I mean, I've been there. It feels bad. I wanted, before we did leave, do you guys remember? I think it's still in the game. I'm sure. I haven't personally used it in a long time, but I remember it used to be inevitable in D&D that you would fight a cockatrice. Isn't that the one that can turn a player to stone or something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fairly low level creature, and it was just like, I think it was 3rd, 4th level or something like that. You're going to have to deal with one of those fuckers, and it was never fun. Well, it was always fun, but it was always something you dreaded. You're like, oh god, here comes the cockatrice. Close your eyes.
Do we think we're ready to move on to geek things? All right, I'll go ahead and go first. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been playing a video game called Heroes Hour. This game is very similar in genre to the Heroes of Might and Magic series that came out in the late 90s and 2000s. It is a $10 game. The graphics are very retro for going back, like basically 8 and 16-bit graphic is the aesthetic. The game is not on Steam yet, but you can get it from the website, and there will be there will be a link in the show notes. And if you aren't sure whether or not you want to buy the game, there is a free demo of this game that you can download, and it is the full game, only instead of having access to all of the different factions in the game, you only have access to 3 factions in the game. But otherwise, it is a full game that you are getting with the demo. And it has been a very long time since I found a game that allows for a playable demo that you can just enjoy and decide whether or not you want to actually pay for the game.
That sounds cool. As I mentioned, I've been kind of getting back into a Tolkien mood. A lifelong pet project of mine has been to actually read Lord of the Rings. Unfortunately, I watched the movies first, and it made it very difficult for me to be engaged when I would try. But by golly, I'm back to it, and I'm in 2 towers at this point. But that's not what I'm shouting out. I want to shout out a group who, since the late 80s, have been publishing I guess a newsletter. It's kind of grown into just kind of like almost an academic journal, specifically about Tolkien's invented languages. And it's called the Vanyar Tengwar, published by a group, it's an acronym named ELF. I think it's the Elvish Language Fellowship. I might be messing that up, but it's something like that. And just, over the years, I have, been going back, and on Amazon, you can actually get volumes. I think there's only 5 of them, and they're $10 a piece. And every now and then, you'll run into a reference from somewhere about, oh yeah, this article really explains that. And they really go into, what it does is it reminds you, for anybody who's a fan of just Tolkien himself as an author, is how much he did what we do as hobbyists, and that is just invent a world, and how much a labor of love Middle-earth was for him for over the course of his entire life. And I can super relate to that, as my favorite part of D&D and playing D&D is inventing the world. And, in particular, I recently bought a volume for one article called the Osanwe Kenta, and it was a scribble of like a little, almost like a dissertation on Tolkien's philosophy of how elves even like spoke, and how at one point their language was completely mental and unspoken, and how that impacted the spoken language once they got away from where they eventually were no longer able to do that so well, and they had to actually speak in words, and how that affected the development of his languages. But anyway, I want to give a shout out to that labor of love. If you're just super nerdy and love Tolkien's language system, go get in the weeds and go to Amazon and buy a copy of the Vinyar Tangwar. There, you won't be disappointed.
Whoa, that's deep nerd, brother. Love it.
Oh, dude, there are whole volumes dedicated to like Elvish nouns, comparative Elvish nouns from the different versions of Sindarin and Eldarin. Maybe I can't remember.
Did Tolkien invent orcs? I have it in my head that he created orcs.
I doubt it. I don't know the answer to that, but just from my fandom, he very rarely invented anything whole cloth, because that wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to give English or Old English and Anglo-Saxon, mythology its own thing. And so he borrowed most of his stuff whole cloth out of like the other Germanic mythologies, that is folklores. So I don't know. I would say no, but I can't think of any other reference to orcs.
I could be wrong, but I thought for sure that he took like a very general idea of like goblins and like, just vague bad guy kinds of things, and like shaped the orc as we think of them today, as all the things we think about orcs.
I didn't know until recently that all the names, pretty much all the names of the dwarves that were in The Hobbit and in his mythology, were pretty much all lifted from a Norse saga called I can't remember the name of it now, but there's a particular Icelandic folklore that managed to survive the ages, and they list off various dwarves, and they were like pretty much all the dwarves from The Hobbit, like spelling and everything. It was kind of wild. The Poetic Edda, that's what it's called.
Wow, there's a whole article on whether or not Tolkien invented orcs. All right, deep stuff. Okay, so my geek thing is it's a book based on a blog by the same name. It is called The Monsters Know What They Are Doing. It's a 543 page book by Keith Amon, I guess. Just goes through in sections, monster type by monster type, focused on Dungeons and Dragons, but there's not really any game mechanics in here. I mean, there's some reference to stuff like it, but it's mostly any kind of game system that has these types of creatures in them. They'd probably act similarly to how it's described. It's really cool. I mean, it's definitely worth a read if you're like, what the fuck? How do I put will-o-wisps into combat? How does a will-o-wisp fight? He's got a chapter on that. So it's a cool book. I'm going to use this in my upcoming campaign for sure. The Monsters Know What They're Doing. Check it out.
All right, guys. What do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Sounds like a plan.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale, and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.